Most people think Nehemiah was a hero. He wasn't. Now, he certainly was a godly man, and he probably was a great leader, but the whole of Ezra and Nehemiah together are designed to teach us that Nehemiah failed. There are 3 design patterns hidden in these books which point us to this devastating conclusion. Here's design pattern 1, 2, and 3. Now, by the end of this video, you will see both the incredible literary design of Ezra-Nehemiah and how Israel's post-exilic failure points beyond Nehemiah to their need for a Messiah. But perhaps most importantly, you're going to walk away from this video with a tool that you can use to teach these books, whether that's in your church or your small group or even around the dinner table. So go ahead and take a look at the description below for a link where you can download this chart. Let's begin by setting the stage. So the tragic history of Nehemiah records the final events of Old Testament biblical history. How did we get here? Well, way back in 722, Assyria is going to conquer the northern tribes of Israel, take them off into exile. And then 100 years later, Babylon will conquer Assyria and take Judah off into exile as well. Now, this deportation of Judah takes place in 3 waves, 3 successive deportations. The first of which, take a look at this Ezekiel timeline, the first of which is in 605. In 605, Daniel and his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are taken into exile in Babylon, and then Ezekiel and Jehoiachin follow them in 597. That's the second deportation, and the third and final one in 586. That is the year when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem and brings most of the rest of the inhabitants of Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, curiously, in the same way that there are 3 deportations to Babylon, so there will be 3 returns from exile as well. Take a look at this timeline now, which records all of the events of the post-exilic history, beginning in 539 with Edict of Cyrus, when Zerubbabel and Joshua bring the first group of exiles back to Judah. And then, after approximately 57 years of silence, Ezra is going to show up on the scene in 458, bringing that second group of exiles back from Babylon. And then in 444, 445, Nehemiah brings back a final group from exile. Now, these 3 returns take us to our first literary design pattern in Ezra-Nehemiah, which signal to us that these narratives are not to be read as a success story, but rather as a tragedy. So each of these 3 returns has its own accompanying building project. So Zerubbabel, the first return, he will rebuild the temple. And of course, Nehemiah, his task is to rebuild the walls. Ezra, here in the middle, in 458, we're saying that he came to rebuild the Torah community, and we'll explain more what that means in a minute. Now, the author has designed each of these return and rebuild cycles to follow a similar pattern. Now, this pattern is going to begin very positively, but end very negatively. The pattern begins with a Persian king who effectively sponsors Judah's return from exile. So first cycle with Zerubbabel and the temple. We read in chapter 6 that Cyrus, the Persian king, is going to issue a decree saying that the house of the Lord, the temple, should be rebuilt. And, look down at verse 4, let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. All right, sounds good. Ezra, he's going to show up in chapter 7, and this time it is Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And in verse 11, we read about a letter that Artaxerxes gave to Ezra, in which he wrote, verse 20, whatever else is required for the house of your God, O scribe, priest Ezra, you may provide it out of the king's treasury. That's great. And of course, Nehemiah as well, same king, Artaxerxes, Nehemiah will ask him for timber to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and Artaxerxes says, sweet, you can have it. Take all the timber you need. So far, all very good news, very positive. And what's more, these returns are described using new Exodus imagery. So Ezra, he is portrayed as the new Moses because Ezra, he is going to time his departure from Babylon to be on the exact same day of the year that Moses left Egypt. And then Nehemiah, he is portrayed kind of as a new Joshua, because in the same way that Joshua spied out the city of Jericho, so Nehemiah will spy out the city of Jerusalem by night to inspect its walls. But then each one of these building projects is going to face opposition. You remember, Zerubbabel, he begins his construction of the temple and it all goes great at first. In 538, he builds the altar. 536, he completes the foundation of the temple, but then work on the temple is delayed for 16 full years. And of course, Nehemiah as well, in his construction of the walls, faces opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem. But thankfully, this opposition is overcome. Here in chapter 5 of Ezra, the opposition to the rebuilding of the walls is overcome through the prophetic ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, who prophesied to the Jews so that Zerubbabel and Joshua begin again to rebuild the temple of God. And then, of course, you remember the heroic action of Nehemiah, who orders his men to hold a hammer in one hand and a spear in the other. And thanks to their zeal, the walls of Jerusalem are completed in record time. Sounds pretty heroic, doesn't it? I mean, Nehemiah is no failure here in chapter 4. I mean, the guy looks more like Russell Crowe from Gladiator to me. Why then am I calling him a failure? Well, the secret is in these hidden design patterns. The first design pattern begins with a Persian king, but it ends with an anticlimax, which is a signal to the reader that all is not as it should be. The excitement of the return and the successful rebuilding project is tempered by some deeply unsettling bad news. For example, if the temple is completed, why are the people weeping about it? Take a look at Ezra chapter 3. Now this is after the foundation of the temple was completed. It says that old men who had seen the first house, that's Solomon's temple, they wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this second temple being laid. They wept so loudly that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. Now, why is this? It's because this second temple is nothing like the first. Now, if God is going to restore the glory of Solomon's kingdom, now that Israel has come back from exile, shouldn't their temple at least resemble his? But it's even worse than that. You see, what happened after Solomon completed his temple? Well, we read about it in 1 Kings 7. Thus, all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. And now in chapter 8, it says that a cloud filled the house of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord had filled the temple. Now, we have no record of God's glory filling the second temple. What about Ezra? Well, Ezra rebuilds what we're calling the Torah community, and he does so by enacting spiritual reforms, which is great. But his crowning achievement in chapter 10 is a community-wide mass divorce, where he calls on Israelites to put away their foreign wives. I mean, that's morally ambiguous to say the least. And I think that we're supposed to read it that way because the text describes this day of mass divorce as a time of heavy rain. Do you like this funny little diagram I have here? I teach classes through every book of the Bible, and you can check out a free course, which is kind of like this, in the description below. But anyways, this time of heavy rain is significant because the Bible almost never describes the setting of its narratives. And especially this heavy rain, it says it was a rain which made the people tremble. This can't be a good thing. Finally, our hero, Nehemiah, who himself does everything right, we learn in chapter 5 is surrounded by Israelites who do everything Wrong. Nehemiah chapter 5, a great outcry rose up from the people of the land against their own brothers. Why? Well, in order to pay the Persian king's tax, they had to mortgage their own fields, their vineyards, their homes, even selling their sons and daughters into slavery. Now, who are they selling their fields to? Who are they getting loans from? Well, look at verse 7. Nehemiah says that he brought charges against the nobles and officials there in Jerusalem, the Jews, saying to them, "You're extracting interest each from his own brother." The author calls attention to this failure narrative in two important ways. First, Nehemiah chapter 5 reads like an interruption. It just doesn't fit. I mean, you can go ahead and you can read chapter 4, skip right over chapter 5, and continue reading in chapter 6, and the story doesn't skip a beat. Chapter 5 then feels unnecessary. It's like an out-of-place addition to the text. And that's on purpose. The author is calling attention to Israel's failure. And he does so in a second way as well. You see, the whole of Nehemiah 1 to 7, this entire section reads as a perfect chiasm. Each story has its corresponding pair, except for chapter 5, which is like this glaring interruption here in the middle of this beautiful chiasm in 1 to 7. Here comes chapter 5 just stomping all over everything as a reminder to the reader that this early success of Nehemiah is not going to last. But this author is not done with his criticism of the post-exilic community. There are still two more patterns which are designed to teach us that though Israel has returned from exile, their hearts are still in Babylon. Now, again, if you'd like a copy of this chart for your personal study or for your use in a ministry context, you can go ahead and download it in the description below. And while you're there, I'd appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any upcoming charts or resources that I'm sharing. Next design pattern. I'm calling this Nehemiah's 3 Torah cycles. And this is definitely another high point in the narrative. It's all very positive. So 3 times a specific date is going to be specified on which the people assemble, they gather together to hear the Torah read aloud, and then the people respond to that reading with some kind of act of faith. So take a look at how this works, these 3 Torah cycles. Here's the cycle number 1 in chapter 8. When the 7th month came, there's our specific date, all the people gathered together so they could hear Ezra the priest read the book of the law of Moses. And then all the people, they celebrate, they eat and they drink because they understood the words that were declared to them. I mean, this is beautiful, and it's going to happen 2 more times. The people will gather, they will come together, asaf, that's the word in Hebrew. They'll come together to study the words of the Lord, to read from the book of the law, and then they have some kind of act of faith, an act of repentance. Here in chapter 8, it says that the people began again to celebrate the Feast of Booths after it had been neglected for so many years. And then in chapter 10, the people enter into a firm covenant to do all the commandments of the Lord. This sounds fantastic. It looks like the revival that Israel has been waiting for. But all this good news is just a setup for one big fall in chapter 13. Nehemiah 13 is why Nehemiah was a failure, by which I mean that the post-exilic Israel, which Nehemiah attempted to lead, failed morally and thus proved that the kingdom promised to them would not come in their days. We see this in Nehemiah's final design pattern. I'm calling this the 3 confrontation cycles in chapter 13. Now, the events of this chapter take place during Nehemiah's 2nd term as governor. So his first term as governor was in 445. That's when he got back to Judah from Persia, and he served as governor for 12 years. Of course, that's when the walls were completed. But then in 432, he was required to go back to Persia, and when he got back to Judah 2 years later, in the year 430, he discovered that everything that he worked to build was falling apart. This disaster is crafted in 3 negative cycles, matching the 3 positive cycles of 8 through 10. Now, each cycle is going to begin with Nehemiah discovering some new sin in the post-exilic community, a sin which he confronts and then attempts to correct. And then finally, the cycle ends with some kind of prayer of Nehemiah, which almost feels like an apology to God for his failed leadership in Israel. So take a look at these 3 cycles. So first we have the discovery. He found out. In those days, Nehemiah saw. He saw a particular sin in Israel, so he confronted that sin with the same Hebrew word, rayav, rayav, rayav. I confronted Israel for their negligence of the law, and then he attempted to reform the community, correct that sinful behavior, and then he issues this prayer, remember me, oh my God, remember this in my favor, oh God, remember me, remember them, which almost feels like he said, oh God, at least I tried, these people are so difficult. So what were the Israelites doing wrong? What was their sin in each one of these 3 cycles? Well, first off, cycle number 1, the tithes are not being given to the Levites. Secondly, they're working on the Sabbath. And third, the Israelites are intermarrying with foreign women again. So what makes these sins so bad? It's because of the way that the author designed this chapter, Nehemiah 13, as an inversion of the reformations of 8 through 10. So, for example, in chapter 10, remember the Israelites enter into a firm covenant to do all the commandments of the Lord. And then it's going to list 7 commandments that they promise to do. Take a look at this. Nehemiah chapter 10, this is the firm covenant that they make. They promise to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things. But then here comes Nehemiah 13, in which 5 of those 7 things are systematically broken. The promises that they made in chapter 10 are broken in chapter 13, culminating with this word. Nehemiah says, why is the house of God forsaken? Why is it azaved? Now, this is even more potent because in chapter 10, the people promise, we will not azav the house of our God. We will not neglect it. And here they are forsaking, neglecting the house of God in Nehemiah chapter 13. This line is signaling for us the undoing of everything that the post-exilic reformers had built. So Zerubbabel, he builds the temple, and the temple is metaphorically broken down in Nehemiah 13 when the Israelites are going to invite Tobiah the Ammonite to live inside of the temple courts. Ezra rebuilds the Torah community by removing intermarriage from that group. But then in Nehemiah 13, the people start doing it again. Nehemiah, he builds the walls, but those same walls are desecrated by Israel when they let merchants come in and out through the walls on the Sabbath. It is as if the entire macro structure of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah is anticipating this fall. So, Nehemiah was a failure, not as a person himself, but in his effort to lead post-exilic Israel into the righteousness necessary to precede the reestablishment of their kingdom. That is the message of Ezra-Nehemiah. That is what we are supposed to learn from these tragic books. In the sweep of redemptive history, God entered into a covenant with Israel in which he promised them incredible blessings, but also warned of devastating consequences. Now, Israel failed as God's covenant partners, and therefore they experienced those covenant consequences. But their prophets told them that one day God would bring them back from exile, and that he would bring back the glory of their kingdom also. Now, Israel, they have come back from exile, but Ezra and Nehemiah teach us that this return did not fulfill the prophetic expectations of the restoration of Israel. Israel is still waiting for those prophecies to be fulfilled. Therefore, Ezra-Nehemiah is a book which points beyond itself. It says, this is not it. The story doesn't end here. Israel may have returned from exile in Babylon, but they still need another kind of exodus, an exodus from slavery to sin. Only then, when all Nehemiah 5s and Nehemiah 13s are behind them, will Israel be ready to inherit the promised physical kingdom over which a literal son of David will rule over all nations from his throne in Jerusalem. This same redemptive arc is taught in the book of Psalms, which is not a collection of independent Israelite hymns. No, rather it is a literary masterpiece designed where groups of psalms work together to communicate a single theological message about the coming Messiah and his kingdom. If you want to learn more about how the book of Psalms points to the coming of the Messiah, you should check out this next video.